Jake Reynolds had always been the kind of person who loved attention. He enjoyed making people laugh, even if it meant doing something silly or rude. At 25 years old, he had traveled to many places, but he never really cared about the history or culture of the places he visited. For him, traveling was all about having fun, taking pictures, and making jokes. When he and his two best friends, Mark and Ryan, landed in London, Jake was excited, but not for the usual reasons. While most tourists were eager to see the famous landmarks, learn about the city's past, and experience British traditions, Jake had a different plan in mind. He wanted to find something unusual, something he could turn into a joke for his social media followers. As they stepped out of the airport, Jake stretched his arms and grinned. "London, here we come," he said loudly, making sure people around him could hear. His friends laughed, already knowing that he would find a way to cause a scene wherever they went. Their first stop was Buckingham Palace. The moment Jake saw the grand gates and the beautifully designed palace, he whistled in amusement. "Wow, this is fancy," he said, taking out his phone to start recording. But what caught his attention the most were the royal guards standing tall and still in their bright red uniforms and tall black hats. Jake had heard about them before. He knew that no matter what happened, they weren't allowed to move or react. This to him was both funny and interesting. "Hey guys, watch this," he whispered to Mark and Ryan, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. He walked up to the line of tourists standing near the guards and started making faces. He waved his hands in front of one guard's face, trying to get a reaction. The soldier didn't even blink. The crowd around him chuckled at his silly behavior, and Jake took that as encouragement. Feeling bolder, he started telling jokes loudly, hoping to break the guard's serious expression. "Hey, do you ever get tired of standing there? Do they at least give you a chair on your lunch break?" He joked. Again, no response. Some tourists giggled, while others shook their heads in disapproval. Mark and Ryan laughed, but warned him to be careful. "Dude, don't push it," Mark said. "These guys take their jobs seriously." But Jake wasn't listening. He was enjoying the attention too much. He pulled out his phone again, ready to take a video for his social media. He wanted to do something that would make people talk. Something different. Then, without thinking, he stepped even closer to one of the guards. His heart pounded with excitement. He was about to do something that would make his friends and followers laugh for days. He smirked, leaned forward, and prepared for his next move, unaware that what he was about to do would change his trip and his life forever. Jake stood near the guard, his phone ready to capture the moment. The tall soldier remained still, staring straight ahead as if Jake didn't even exist. The silence made Jake more eager to do something bold. He wanted a reaction, even the smallest flinch. His heart raced with excitement. Ryan and Mark stood a few steps away, watching with nervous amusement. They had seen Jake pull pranks before, but this was different. This was the Royal Guard, one of the most disciplined soldiers in the world. "Bro, maybe that's enough," Ryan whispered, sensing that Jake was about to cross a line. But Jake wasn't listening. He was too caught up in the moment, too focused on getting the perfect video. He raised his phone and grinned. "All right, guys, let's see if these guys are really made of stone," he said into the camera. Then, in a moment of thoughtless excitement, he leaned forward and blew a small puff of air toward the guard's face. Nothing. The guard didn't even blink. The crowd around them gasped softly, some looking uncomfortable. Others simply shook their heads and walked away. Jake wasn't done. He wanted to make this unforgettable. He tilted his head, looking directly at the camera on his phone, and said, "What if I?" Before he could finish his sentence, he did something he would immediately regret. He made a rude noise with his lips, pretending to challenge the guard's patience. It was meant to be funny, just another silly joke. But the moment the sound left his mouth, the atmosphere changed. The guard, still unmoving, seemed even more powerful in his silence. The heavy presence of the palace, the history, and the weight of the uniform he wore made Jake's actions feel suddenly out of place. A few tourists stepped back, whispering to each other. Jake noticed a security officer standing nearby, watching the situation closely. The officer's expression was serious. He was dressed in a dark suit, his earpiece barely visible, and his sharp eyes locked onto Jake. Mark nudged Jake's arm. "Hey man, I think we should go." For the first time, Jake felt a small wave of uncertainty. He glanced around and noticed how different the energy had become. His excitement turned into an uneasy feeling. His joke wasn't landing the way he thought it would. Instead of laughter, he saw frowns. Instead of cheers, he heard whispers of disapproval. Then, the security officer took a step forward. His movements were calm but firm, as if he had seen this type of behavior before. He didn't say a word, but his presence alone made Jake's confidence shrink. Ryan grabbed Jake's shoulder and whispered urgently, "Dude, I don't think this is funny anymore." For the first time on this trip, Jake felt small. He had come here looking for fun, for a viral moment, but suddenly everything felt different. The guard remained still, strong, and unmoved, while Jake felt himself becoming weaker with each passing second. Jake felt his heartbeat quicken as the security officer closed the distance between them. The air around him seemed heavier now, filled with an uneasy silence. The laughter he had expected from the crowd never came. Instead, he felt their eyes on him, some curious, some disapproving. He shifted uncomfortably, realizing that maybe he had gone too far. The security officer, a tall man with sharp features, stopped just a few feet away from Jake. His expression was calm but firm. He didn't raise his voice, but there was authority in his presence. "Sir, step aside," he said in a professional tone. Jake hesitated. His mind raced for a way to play this off as a harmless joke, but he could see that the officer wasn't amused. Mark and Ryan stood frozen, their earlier amusement replaced with concern. It was just a joke," Jake muttered, forcing a small chuckle. "No harm done." The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced at the guard Jake had been taunting. The soldier remained still, his face unreadable, his discipline unshaken. The sight made Jake feel even more foolish. He had been trying to get a reaction from someone who had trained for years to remain composed under any circumstance. "You need to come with me," the officer finally said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Jake's stomach twisted. He looked at his friends, hoping they would step in, but they only gave him nervous glances. He realized then that they weren't going to back him up this time. He took a deep breath and nodded. "All right," he said, trying to sound casual, but his voice was quieter now. He followed the officer past the crowd, who whispered as they watched him go. He no longer felt like the center of attention in a fun way. Instead, he felt exposed, like a child who had just been caught misbehaving. The officer led him through a side entrance of the palace grounds. The further they walked, the more serious everything felt. The grand walls of Buckingham Palace surrounded him, reminding him of just how small he really was in comparison. Finally, they stopped in a quiet hallway. The officer turned to face him. "Do you understand what you just did?" he asked, his tone still calm but firm. Jake shifted uncomfortably. "It was just a joke," he repeated weakly. The officer's eyes didn't waver. That joke was an act of disrespect toward a soldier who was sworn to serve and protect. The Royal Guards are not just part of a tradition. They are trained professionals, some of whom have served in real combat. Their discipline is not something to mock. Jake swallowed hard. He had never thought about it like that. To him, they were just people in funny uniforms, standing still for tourists to gawk at. But now, hearing it from the officer, he felt a knot of guilt in his stomach. The officer continued, "Do you think this is funny now?" Jake shook his head slowly. He had started the day looking for entertainment, but now he was beginning to see that not everything was a joke. And something told him that this lesson wasn't over yet. Jake stood in the quiet hallway, his heart still pounding. He had expected the officer to let him off with a simple warning, maybe a short lecture about respect. But the serious expression on the officer's face told him that this was more than just a small mistake. It wasn't going to be forgotten so easily. For the first time since arriving in London, Jake felt completely out of control. Usually, he could talk his way out of trouble, crack a joke, or make people laugh to lighten the mood. But none of that was working now. The officer crossed his arms and studied him for a moment. "You may not realize it, but what you did was more serious than you think," he said. "You disrespected someone who stands for something greater than just a uniform." Jake shifted his weight uncomfortably. "Look, I didn't mean any harm," he said, his voice quieter than before. "I was just messing around." The officer nodded slightly. "I believe you. But that doesn't change the fact that your actions were inappropriate." He paused before adding, "Do you know what it takes to become a Royal Guard?" Jake hesitated. He had never thought about it before. "I mean, they just stand there, right?" he said, though his voice lacked the confidence it usually carried. The officer's eyes remained steady. "That's what most tourists think. But the truth is, these guards go through some of the toughest training in the world. They're not just here for show. They are soldiers, highly disciplined, and trained to serve and protect. Many of them have real combat experience. They don't move, not because they can't, but because they are trained to remain calm under any circumstance." Jake swallowed hard. He had never considered that before. To him, the guards were like statues, part of the scenery at Buckingham Palace. But now, standing here, he was beginning to see them differently. The officer continued, "These men and women dedicate their lives to service. They stand in the heat, the cold, the rain, without flinching. And yet, people like you come here and try to make them into a joke." Jake felt a lump form in his throat. He had thought he was being funny, but now he just felt foolish. His stomach twisted as the realization sank in. The officer took a step closer. "You may have thought this was harmless fun, but you insulted someone who represents centuries of history, sacrifice, and discipline. If a stranger disrespected you in public, how would you feel?" Jake lowered his head. He didn't need to answer. He already knew the feeling. Embarrassment, shame, regret. The officer sighed and looked at him for a long moment before speaking again. "I could call the authorities and have you officially charged with public misconduct," he said. "But instead, I'm going to give you a chance to learn from this." Jake lifted his eyes, surprised. "Learn from this? How?" he asked hesitantly. The officer gave him a measured look. "You're about to find out." Jake's stomach tightened. He had no idea what was coming next, but something told him this would be a lesson he would never forget. Jake stood frozen, his mind racing with thoughts. What did the officer mean by "learn from this"? Was he going to be fined? Kicked out of the palace grounds? Worse, would he be arrested? His stomach twisted at the thought. The officer didn't say anything right away. Instead, he motioned for Jake to follow him. Without another word, they walked down a hallway and through a door that led to a quieter part of the palace grounds. The noise of tourists faded away, and all Jake could hear was the sound of his own footsteps and the occasional rustling of the wind. After a short walk, they entered a room that looked like a training area. The walls were decorated with pictures of past and present royal guards. There were uniforms on display, medals and plaques, with names of soldiers who had served with honor. The officer stopped and turned to face Jake. "Sit," he said, pointing to a wooden bench. Jake obeyed, feeling more nervous than ever. For a moment, there was silence. Then the officer spoke again. "You see these names?" He gestured toward the plaques on the wall. "These are the names of men and women who have dedicated their lives to serving their country. Some of them have stood in the same place where you disrespected that guard today." Jake looked at the names. He didn't recognize any of them, but suddenly, they felt important. Real. The officer continued. "Some of these soldiers didn't just stand outside a palace. They fought in real battles. They protected people. Some of them never made it home. His voice was calm but carried a deep weight that made Jake's chest feel tight. Jake swallowed hard. He hadn't thought about any of this before. To him, the guards had been nothing more than a sight for tourists, a part of the experience, like the red buses and phone booths. He had never stopped to wonder who they really were or what they had been through. The officer studied Jake's face for a moment, then said, "You need to understand something. The Royal Guard is not here for entertainment. They are a symbol of dedication and service. What you did today may have seemed like a joke, but it was an insult to everything they stand for." Jake felt his face grow warm. He lowered his head, unable to meet the officer's eyes. He had never felt so ashamed in his life. After a long pause, the officer took a deep breath. "Now," he said, his voice firm but not unkind, "you have a choice. You can walk out of here, forget this ever happened, and continue your trip as if nothing is wrong. Or you can take responsibility and do something to make this right." Jake's heart pounded. "Make it right?" he asked quietly. The officer nodded. "That depends on you. Are you ready to own up to your mistake?" Jake didn't answer right away. He thought about his friends, his social media, his usual carefree attitude. But none of that mattered now. He had been wrong, and he knew it. Taking a deep breath, he looked up and met the officer's eyes. "What do I have to do?" The officer gave a small nod of approval. "Follow me," he said. Jake stood up, his legs feeling shaky. He didn't know what was ahead, but one thing was certain. This was no longer just a trip. This was about to become a lesson he would never forget. Jake followed the officer through another hallway, his heart beating faster with every step. His mind was filled with questions. What was he about to face? Was this going to be a punishment, or was it truly a lesson? Either way, he knew one thing. There was no turning back now. After a short walk, they reached an open training ground behind the palace. A few royal guards were practicing drills, their movements sharp and disciplined. They marched in perfect sync, their boots hitting the ground at the exact same time. The sight was impressive, and for the first time, Jake saw them differently. They weren't just standing outside the palace for show. They were soldiers, professionals who took their duty seriously. The officer stopped and turned to face Jake. "If you truly want to understand the dedication of a royal guard, you're going to step into their shoes for a little while," he said. Jake blinked in surprise. "Wait, what?" The officer gestured toward a nearby training uniform. It wasn't the full Royal Guard uniform, but it was similar, a heavy red coat, black trousers, and sturdy boots. "You're going to stand like a guard for the next hour," the officer said. "No moving, no talking, no reacting." Jake's mouth fell open. "An hour?" he repeated, his voice almost cracking. The officer gave a small nod. "Yes, just like they do. And let me remind you, a real guard does this for hours, sometimes in extreme heat or freezing cold." Jake hesitated. This wasn't what he expected. He had thought maybe he would just apologize and leave, but this was something else. Still, deep inside, he knew he had to do it. He had embarrassed a soldier, and now he had a chance to truly understand what it felt like to stand in their position. He took a deep breath and nodded. "Okay," he said. "I'll do it." The officer handed him the training uniform. "Put this on," he instructed. Jake stepped into a small changing area and quickly put on the coat, pants, and boots. The moment he slipped his arms into the heavy jacket, he realized something. It was much heavier than he had expected. The fabric was thick and stiff, and within minutes he could feel the weight pressing down on his shoulders. When he stepped back outside, the officer motioned him toward a marked area. "Stand here," he said. "Back straight, chin up, hands at your sides." Jake did as he was told, straightening his posture. The officer's expression grew serious. "Now remember, no matter what happens, you cannot move. Guards deal with all kinds of distractions. people making faces, tourists trying to get a reaction. You must remain still. Jake swallowed hard. It sounded easy, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't be. The officer checked his posture one last time. Your time starts now. Jake stood there, completely still. The first few minutes weren't so bad. But as time passed, his legs started to ache, and the weight of the coat became uncomfortable. The sun felt hotter, his back grew stiff, and his muscles burned from standing in the same position. He had always thought standing still was easy, but now, for the first time, he realized just how wrong he had been. Minutes passed, but to Jake, it felt like hours. His legs were beginning to tremble, and his back ached from standing so straight. The heavy coat pressed down on his shoulders, making it hard to breathe properly. Sweat formed on his forehead, but he couldn't wipe it away. His hands had to stay at his sides, motionless. At first, he had thought this would be easy. How hard could it be to stand still? But now, he realized just how much effort it actually took. Every muscle in his body screamed for movement, but he couldn't give in. The officer stood nearby, watching him closely. "Not as simple as it looks, is it?" he said calmly. Jake didn't answer. He wasn't allowed to speak. Soon, a few palace staff members walked by, glancing at him with curiosity. One of them smirked, as if amused by the sight of a tourist experiencing what a real guard goes through. A few guards in training were also watching from a distance, their expressions unreadable. Jake's mind drifted to his earlier actions. Just a short while ago, he had been mocking a real royal guard, trying to make him react, completely unaware of the discipline and strength it took to remain still. Now he was in that position himself, and it was humiliating. As time crawled on, a light breeze brushed against his face, offering brief relief from the heat. But then something happened that made his challenge even harder. Ryan and Mark appeared at the edge of the training ground. They had been waiting for him outside, but now they had found their way here. The moment they saw Jake standing in the training uniform, completely still, their eyes widened in surprise. Ryan nudged Mark. "Dude, is he actually doing this?" Mark chuckled. "This is priceless. We have to record this." Jake wanted to groan, but he couldn't. His friends pulled out their phones and started recording. They whispered jokes to each other, laughing under their breath. "Hey, Jake," Ryan called out. "What happened to making fun of the guards, huh? Looks like you've become one now." Mark grinned. "Yeah, man. Give us a salute or something." Jake clenched his jaw. He wanted to tell them to be quiet, to make them understand how wrong they had all been, but he couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He had to stand there and take it, just like the real guards did. The officer shot a sharp glance at Ryan and Mark, and immediately their laughter died down. He took a step forward and spoke in a calm but firm voice. "The lesson isn't just for him," he said. "You should both take a moment to think about why this is happening." Ryan and Mark exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, they seemed to realize that this wasn't just a joke anymore. Jake, meanwhile, felt a shift inside him. His pride, his ego, everything that had driven him to mock the guard earlier, was disappearing. In its place, a new feeling was growing: respect, understanding, regret. As the seconds ticked by, he no longer thought about how hard it was to stand still. Instead, he thought about the soldier he had disrespected. He wondered how many times that guard had been laughed at by people like him, how many times he had been tested by tourists who didn't understand what he stood for. Jake's legs burned, his back ached, and sweat dripped down his neck. But he didn't move. He was determined to see this through. This wasn't just about standing still anymore. It was about understanding. The officer glanced at his watch. "That's 1 hour," he said finally. Relief flooded through Jake, but he didn't collapse like he wanted to. He held his posture for a few more seconds before finally stepping back. The moment he moved, his legs wobbled, and he had to take a deep breath to steady himself. The officer gave him a nod of approval. "You lasted the full time. Not bad for a first attempt." Jake looked at him, still catching his breath. That was way harder than I thought, he admitted. The officer's expression remained calm. Now imagine doing it for 6 hours, in the freezing cold or under the scorching sun, without even blinking at distractions. Jake's mind flashed back to the royal guard he had mocked. He felt a deep shame settle in his chest. What he had done was wrong. And now he understood why. The officer studied Jake's face for a moment before speaking again. "I think you've learned something today," he said. Jake nodded slowly. "Yeah, I really have." Ryan and Mark, who had been silent for the last few minutes, finally stepped forward. They no longer looked amused. In fact, they looked uncomfortable, as if they were realizing their own mistakes. Ryan rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Man, we were just joking earlier. We didn't think it was that serious." Jake let out a small sigh. "Yeah, well, it is. We were wrong." Mark looked guilty. "So, what now?" The officer took a step back and motioned toward the palace entrance. "There's one last thing left to do." Jake didn't need to ask what that was. He already knew. A few minutes later, he stood once again in front of the royal guard. The same soldier he had disrespected earlier. The guard was still in position, his face unreadable, just as disciplined as before. Jake swallowed hard, feeling nervous. He had never apologized like this before, but he knew he had to. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry," he said sincerely. "I was disrespectful, and I didn't understand what it meant to be in your position. But now I do." The guard, of course, didn't move or react. He simply continued his duty, as he always did. But Jake didn't need a response. Just saying the words out loud made him feel like he was finally making things right. As Jake turned to leave, he felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The lesson he had learned today would stay with him for the rest of his life. As they walked away from the palace, Ryan nudged him. "So, no more messing with the guards, huh?" Jake gave a small smile. "Not a chance." Mark laughed. "Guess this trip ended up being more educational than we expected." Jake nodded, looking back at the palace one last time. "Yeah, and I wouldn't change a thing."